By the way, in the Roman Constitution, you also have what they call novellae, which means new things inserted to take care of certain conditions. So you have imperial decrees. The emperor says, on this and this date, a new law I'm inserting because of this problem. So you have not only the Constitution, what we would call the basic text, but you have amendments, and then you have novellae, that is, new things stuck in. The Constitution reveals something very interesting. It reveals that the Jews were an important factor in the commercial welfare of the empire, especially outside of Rome, in the colonial areas. They were also an important factor in carrying Roman civilization and the Latin language into these areas. The Jews, by virtue of their economic activity, benefited the Roman Empire. You set up business and it's flourishing, you pay taxes, you're doing well for the empire. The Jews did something else, which was not known by too many Romans, and that is that the Jews maintained their own communities. And I want to tell you something fascinating if you're not aware of it. This goes back thousands of years. It goes back at least 2,000 years, probably more. The Jews have always maintained a united Jewish appeal all over the world and collected funds for many purposes. Of course, there was always a fund for the support of the temple in Jerusalem, because that existed. There were also funds that Jews collected to take care of their own needs. So Jews had schools, and by the way, compulsory education is Jewish for over 2,000 years. Nobody ever had compulsory education until modern 20th century. We established compulsory education in 68 BC. They said every Jewish child at the age of 5 has to start to learn how to read and write Hebrew language and start studying the Torah. So that's already recorded. And therefore the Jews were always literate, even in lands where the rest of the population was not. And because the Jews learned how to write the Hebrew alphabet from childhood, whenever they had to write any language, they wrote it in the Hebrew alphabet. So of the 20 or 25 languages that the Jews spoke over the course of history, all of them were written in the Hebrew alphabet. The Jews now, what else did they control? They had a school system. Every community had to have a school system supported by the community. They had old age homes. They had hospitals. They had homes for widows who were left without support. They had orphans' homes. The Jews had many institutions which they maintained. That was Jewish life. They also had central authorities. There was a central authority in Jerusalem that administered the Jewish funds over the whole Roman Empire. In Babylon, they had a central authority of Jewish communities in Babylon that took care of Babylonia and Persia, all the way down to India. And this is constant. And by the way, it's reflected in several places. Even in the book of Esther, there's a reference to that there was this universal Jewish, it was a unity of the Jewish people. Moreover, even though the Jews spoke 80 different languages, they always knew Hebrew. Hebrew was a constant. It was a permanent inter-Jewish community means of communication. Even in modern times, let's say Jews came from Northern Europe, and they spoke German or French, and they were communicating with Jews in Turkey who spoke Spanish or Greek. They communicated in Hebrew, as always. And what's interesting is that the Hebrew, medieval Hebrew, it's like modern Hebrew. There's not that much difference between them. The other thing that's interesting to note is I've read a couple of letters that were found in the Cairo Geniza. You know, these, talk about that later, but they're ancient documents that were found in Cairo, extending over hundreds of years, with fragments of all kinds, including books, including whole books, including just little strips of paper. I read 2 letters that were written by Jews 1,000 years ago. One was a letter written by a Greek-speaking Jewish woman living in Alexandria, Egypt, writing to her son in Cairo. These were Greek-speaking Jews, but she writes in Hebrew, and it's pure Hebrew. It's a mother, a housewife, writing to her son, pure Hebrew. So don't tell me that women were not educated. They were, and the Talmud even speaks about Jewish women who were educated in Greek and in Hebrew and so on. So this education was universal. Now, there is an interesting law in the Roman Constitution dated 399. And the emperor says, money collected by the Jewish communities of the empire and sent to their central authority in Israel or in Jerusalem is no longer permitted. They stopped the United Jewish Appeal. Jews can't do it. In the year 404, 5 years later, the emperor issues a decree saying, the law that we passed before forbidding the transmission of Jewish funds is hereby repealed. From now on, the Jews can regain the freedom and the authority to collect funds and to ship it to their central authorities. What happened? Okay, I'll tell you. Well, what happened is that after the Jews were forbidden to connect the United Jewish Appeal, the municipal authorities appealed to the emperor. They said, something's happening here. People are applying for funds who never applied before. All of a sudden, there are applications for relief, there are applications for hospital, there are applications increasing. Where did they come from? We know what's interesting is that Rome, at one point, 10% of its population was on relief. All of a sudden, the applications increase. What's happening? So they said, well, all these new applicants are Jews. So they said to them, where did you get your money last month or before? We got it from the Jewish Community Fund. The emperor said, you mean to tell me that the Jews took care of this by themselves? Well, then let them do it. Now you can see what conflict go on. The church keeps saying, down on the Jews, down on the Jews. And the emperor says, take it easy. You know, they're good for the empire. And they're doing a lot of good for the empire. So you can see the conflict between church and state going on that question at least, namely on the Jews. Finally, by the way, he did abolish the patriarchate of the Jews in Jerusalem. There was a central authority. The Sanhedrin in Jerusalem was abolished by the Roman Constitution in the year 425, and that's when they recorded all of their decisions in what we call the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud of Palestine. After that, Jewish communities became self-ruling or independent. In other words, Jewish community of Rome governed itself, and the Jewish community of Paris governed itself, and so on. But they still maintained because they always managed. We can read the correspondence between them. It's interesting that for several centuries, the Jews of Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, would always send emissaries to Europe to examine educational systems, improve their education, do other things, collect funds, and so on. This was always going on between Europe and Israel because, again, they were within the one empire.